All right. So, good evening, everybody. My topic is this evening is why is the conservative movement in such a crisis? And this is the last class until the fall. So, maybe good news or bad, but it does mean that I can't say, oh, we'll pick this up again in 2 weeks. So, um, as far as I get is as far as I get, and then if I leave you with a cliffhanger, I mean, although it shouldn't be, because I don't think that there's any doubt that the movement is in crisis. The question really is why, and if there is anything to be done about it. But as is often my habit, I'm going to start by throwing some statistics at you. The most recent sort of reputable or decent survey of the American Jewish community was done by the Pew Forum. It was released in 2021, but the survey data is from 2020. And this is, when you deal any Jewish demographics data, there is a massive caveat, okay? Because there is no master list of Jews for obvious reasons, right? And so it used to be random digit dialing, but random digit dialing can't be done anymore because nobody answers their phone anymore. I mean, unless it's a number that's in their phone book. So, finding people is hard. Finding Jews is even harder. So this is basically self-identification, right? People who say that they are Jews. And so, there is always, a good reason to question the accuracy of the data. But I haven't really seen much challenge to this data. So, according to the 2020 Pew survey, 25% of American Jews were raised conservative, but 15% are currently conservative. Okay, 28% were raised Reform, 33% are currently Reform. 10% were raised Orthodox, 8% are currently Orthodox. Okay, and that last statistic may be somewhat surprising, right? Because the sort of general consensus is that Orthodoxy in America is booming and they're doing really well, and everybody else is of service, okay? But that 10% who say they were raised Orthodox includes a lot of older people, right? Who, like, if my dad were still alive, he would say he was raised Orthodox, right? If you asked him for his current affiliation, his true affiliation was unaffiliated. Depending on the day of the week, he might have said Reform or Conservative. But either way, he wouldn't have said Orthodox, but that was the way he was raised. So there's a lot of, people, let's say older than me, who were raised Orthodox who are no longer Orthodox, right? Whereas something like close to 30% of American Jews under 18 are Orthodox. Okay, so these statistics may really change significantly as time goes on. Okay, so 17% of American Jews say they were raised as just Jewish, meaning not affiliated or identifying with a particular denomination, but 29% currently identify as just Jewish or not identifying with a particular denomination. So for every person who was not raised conservative but became conservative, i.e., somebody like me, for every person like me who wasn't raised conservative but became conservative, there are 3 people who were raised conservative who are no longer conservative. Okay, whether that means they became Reformed, became Orthodox, became just Jewish, became Episcopalian, whatever, but they were raised conservative and no longer identify as conservative. Okay, now, having said that, right, because everything happens in a context, right? And nothing happens, just on its own. I want to throw out, I mean, I find this to be a fascinating statistic personally. And some of you in other classes, I've raised this statistic before. Okay, the last major demographic study of the greater Washington Jewish community was done in 2017. Okay, and the previous study was done in 2003. So you've got a gap of 14 years between studies. Okay, and the big surprise out of the 2017 study was that there are more Jews in Northern Virginia than there are in Montgomery County. Right, that was the first thing that shocked everybody because nobody expected to find that. And Sue, it's all your fault. But here's the really, really interesting statistic. Okay, if you look at the absolute number of synagogue members, okay, not percentage, absolute number. The absolute number of synagogue members in Greater Washington was like almost identical, within a couple of hundred in 2003 and 2017. Okay? Same number of synagogue members in Greater Washington in 2003 and 2017. Now, here's the question. Good news or bad news? Not a right or a wrong answer. I mean, it could be a trick question, but what do you think? Good news or bad news? Yeah, Sue.
I don't know. I see it as both. I mean, I see it's good news because it hasn't decreased, but in a sense, because you expect maybe more children, you feel like it's bad news because it hasn't increased. But then again, if the number of Jews in the area is the same, then you wouldn't necessarily expect the membership to increase. So I don't know.
So Marilyn, what were you
Orthodox?
Barry and I were just talking about if there are more Jews in general, then there should be more synagogue members, but also has it shifted to more synagogue members in Virginia away from DC and Montgomery County?
I didn't see a breakdown for that. I mean,
okay, another point.
Yeah.
In this week's Jewish Week, they did a poll. I guess it was last week because now there's one for this week's poll. It says, "What kind of Jew do you consider yourself?" And 40% say conservative, 19% Reform, 15% Orthodox, and a bunch of other little numbers.
Right. Okay. So let me say 2 things about that. Right. The missing datum in the question that I asked is, what is the comparative size of the community in 2003 and 2017? And the community grew 40%. So if the community grew 40% and synagogue membership grew not at all, that's bad news. right? Because it means that, and Marilyn, you're the accountant, so you can do the math, right? But the percentage of Jews who are members has gone way down, right? If the community grew by 40% and the number of affiliates didn't grow at all. Okay. Now the thing with the Jewish Week polls is that, right, they're not reaching out to you, right? You are answering that because you are on their email mailing list, right? I mean, I argued, from the beginning of the time I got here, that paying for our shul to pay money to advertise in the Washington Jewish Week was a waste. Okay, because people who read the Washington Jewish Week are not the unaffiliated Jews that we think we need to reach. They're just not. If you're reading the Washington Jew, I'm not saying you're super Jew, right? But if you have zero interest in Jewish stuff, you're not reading the Washington Jewish Week, right? So that's the first thing. And, we haven't, it's not time to cover everything, but if you look at good demographic studies of, people are fond of saying there's no difference between reform and conservative, and it's just not true. I mean, conservative Jews are far more likely to concentrate their charitable giving more towards Jewish causes. They're far more likely to have mostly Jewish friends. They're far less likely to be intermarried. They're far more likely to say that Israel is important to them. They're far more likely to have visited Israel, et cetera, okay? They're far more likely to keep kosher. I mean, far more likely. So it's 10% instead of 2%, right? When in theory, for conservative Jews, it should be 100%, right? But in measures of Jewish behavior, there's still a significant difference between conservative affiliated Jews and reform affiliated Jews. Okay. The other thing is that I was thinking about this. Communities tend to be, either conservative or reform. I mean, for whatever reason. I mean, Philadelphia historically has always been very strongly conservative. Baltimore has been more reform. St. Louis has been more reform. Marilyn, before you and I were talking about, there are 11 conservative synagogues in Montgomery County, right? Now, but I think that there's a historical reason for that, okay? I mean, prior to the end of World War II, Montgomery County was nothing, right? I mean, there were, I don't think there were any synagogues of any type in Montgomery County until the late 40s, right? So when the Montgomery County Jewish community was starting to get established, that was the heyday of the conservative movement. The heyday of the conservative movement was the late 40s to the early 60s, which is when, for the most part, the Montgomery County community was starting. So there's a reason that, I'm not getting into, we probably have an oversaturation of conservative synagogues, right? But the fate of any particular synagogue is not the same thing as the fate of the conservative movement overall, right? And even if we had fewer synagogues, the question is, would there be fewer conservative Jews? Would there more, or would there be the same number, right? I mean, So, I mean, I think that there's a historic, in the same sense that, like, Long Island was always conservative because, again, it's mostly a post-World War II phenomenon. At any rate, okay, so as I was saying, so the heyday of conservative Judaism was the 1950s. Okay, and in the 1950s, right, I mean, conservative Judaism was kind of the default option, particularly for children of immigrants. Okay, children of immigrants chose conservative Judaism because orthodoxy was too old fashioned, right? Orthodoxy was too old fashioned, and reform was too goyish, too church-like, right? I mean, and there's an interesting sociological phenomenon known as Hansen's law. Hansen's law says that what the second generation drops, the third generation seeks to reclaim. Okay, so that so children of immigrants, I mean, they may have loved and admired their grandparents, but they didn't want to be like them, right? And so conservative Judaism was a congenial sort of, and if their Orthodox grandparents came to a conservative shul, they would find it not all that different. I mean, the big difference between conservative and Orthodoxy, up until the 60s was what? Mixed seating, right? That was the main difference, right? You didn't have a triennial cycle. You didn't have women clergy. You didn't have women even counting in the minyan or getting aliyahs or anything. The big difference was mixed seating, right? That was the big difference. And so you had also, I mean, many Orthodox rabbis took conservative pulpits, right? Many Orthodox rabbis took conservative pulpits because everybody knew, I mean, this was just like known, okay, that Orthodoxy in America had no future, right? And that therefore, if you wanted to conserve the Jewish future, right, thus the name conservative, conservatism was the place to be, right? I mean, like if you think, like Bethel in Baltimore, Rabbi Jacob Agus, right? So he was ordained from Yeshiva University. Okay, Rabbi Esrog in Baltimore, also from Yeshiva University. I mean, this was very, very common. And I mean, it was just it was common because there wasn't that big a difference, and it was understood that Orthodoxy had no future. Okay, so the point that I want to make, the one point is that what everybody knows to be the case is not always necessarily so, right? Because the big caveat is always if present trends continue, okay? And the assumption being that present trends will continue, and they don't always, right? I mean, the best example of that I saw was, and I didn't take time to look for the statistics, okay? But it was an article exactly about this if present trends continue. And it looked at the number of Elvis impersonators at a certain point in the 60s versus the number of Elvis impersonators in the 80s. And then the author said if present trends continue, by 2025, 1 out of every 3 Americans will be an Elvis impersonator. But there's a big if there, right? And obviously, present trends. I mean, there are a lot of Elvis impersonators, but it's not quite 1 out of 3 Americans. So just like everybody knows that the conservative movement has no future, it's not necessarily so. All right, the question that I want to look at a little bit, though, is how we got here. Okay, and a couple of months ago, we had a guest speaker, Rabbi Danny Schiff, talking about his book Judaism in a Digital Age, and one of Danny's points was that, the question is always, well, what did we do wrong? And Danny's answer is, you didn't do anything, right? That conservative and Reform Judaism are both excellent answers to questions that nobody is asking, right? Because the question that Reform and conservative both sought to ask, they were different answers to the same question, is how can I, as a Jew, be a full participant in Western society without having to convert to Christianity? I mean, basically, that's the question, right? Or how do I adapt my Judaism so that it's not a hindrance to me being accepted as a full participant in American society? And that's not a question that anybody asks anymore. It's not. I mean, Jews are full participants in American society, full stop, right? I mean, look at all of the American presidents with Jewish sons or daughters-in-law, right? Starting with JFK, right? Carolyn Kennedy Schlossberg, right? Chelsea Clinton married a Jew, right? Al Gore, one of Al Gore's daughters, married a Jew. Ivanka and Jared, right? Joe Biden had 3 surviving children, right? One of whom since passed away, right? All 3 of Biden's children married Jews, right? And the fact that if I say that, and some of you say, I didn't even know that, the fact that you might not have known that is in itself significant, right? Because it's not newsworthy anymore, right? And when I lived in Connecticut, and what's his name? When Chris Dodd retired from the Senate, and the Democratic candidate to replace him was Dick Blumenthal. All right. And if Dick Blumenthal won, which he did, there was a period of 2 years when both of Connecticut's senators were Jewish, Dick Blumenthal and Joe Lieberman. Okay. The only people I ever heard say, oh my gosh, we really need to be concerned about having 2 Jewish senators, were Jews, right? I never heard that concern from a single non-Jew, not a single one. Okay, not an issue, not an issue. We are fully accepted in American society, and yes, with the caveat that anti-Semitism is rising and so on and so forth. But look where it's coming from. It's coming from trailer trash. It's not coming from, from the corporate suites. So the question, how do we fit into American society? As it's not a question that people are asking anymore, right? So that's that's what Schiff calls hyper emancipation, right? And I think that there's a lot to what he said. We are offering excellent answers to questions that nobody's asking anymore, right? There's a new book that came out called The Future of American Judaism by Jerome Chanis and Mark Silk. Mark Silk is the head of the Greenberg Center for the Study of American Religion at the University of Hartford, a very well-respected scholar. Chanis is also, I saw an article about it. I thought maybe I would like to get the book. It's $139, so I'm not getting it. But they say, and I quoted this in something that I sent out earlier this week, that the big question for conservative Judaism is how we deal with intermarriage and Jewish identity, right? That's the big issue. And certainly there are, massive fights going on. As right, everybody knows conservative rabbis are not allowed to officiate at intermarriages. We are not allowed to recognize what's known as patrilineal descent, right? Meaning if somebody has a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother, and they identify as a Jew, we are not allowed to recognize them as a Jew. In theory. It means, family comes and they call me up and they say, dad's Jewish, mom is not Jewish. Can we enroll our kids in Hebrew school? The answer is yes, you can certainly enroll your kids in Hebrew school. But there's no bar or bat mitzvah unless the kid goes through a formal conversion, right? Rabbi, my kid's having a bar mitzvah. My brother's wife is not Jewish. They're Reformed. Their kids identify as Jews. Their kids had a bar mitzvah. Can I give them an aliyah? If I know that to be the case, the answer is supposed to be no, right? Now, if you're savvy, you don't volunteer that information. You just give me a list of people that you want to have an aliyah, and I don't necessarily need to ask, excessive numbers of questions, right? But, so it's intermarriage, it's patrilineal descent, it's also divorce and remarriage, because if a Jewish person, and it's interesting, right? Because if somebody comes to me, right, and I say, well, have you been previously married? Right? Yes. Is your ex-spouse Jewish? Right? What is the answer I want to hear? The answer I want to hear is actually no, my ex-spouse is not Jewish, right? But they're sometimes like, oh, the rabbi's going to be mad at me that I was married to a non-Jew, right? But actually, I want the answer to be, yeah, my ex-spouse is not Jewish, because then there's no question of a Jewish divorce, right? And sometimes, procuring a Jewish divorce is relatively costly, it's relatively inconvenient, and sometimes it's impossible if the ex-spouse won't cooperate, right? And therefore there are times when a couple comes to me and it's just I either can't do the marriage or it's too big a hassle, and they go find a reform rabbi, right? So there's a lot of, of issues. The question, so they say that, that the future of conservative Judaism hinges on this. I don't know that they're right. I mean, the question is, would we be in a stronger place if conservative rabbis were allowed to officiate at intermarriages? Would we be at a stronger place if we were allowed to recognize patrilineal descent? If we weren't so strict about, rules of marriage and divorce? And I don't know the answer to that. I'm not really sure that that is as, as big an issue as Silk and Chain is seen to think it is. But I don't know. Just let me throw that out. What do y'all think? I mean, is that something that's really, putting us sort of behind the eight ball? Yeah, Sue.
I don't know. These kind of things are very troubling to me because I like tradition. And what I don't like about Reformed is that I feel like everything from traditional prayers to traditional practices have been thrown out. And possibly the motivation was originally, well, hey, we can assimilate better if we don't have to keep kosher. And if we don't have these prayers, it'll be more English, everyone will understand, and so on and so forth. And I'm not so sure that religion has to dilute itself so much in order to attract people, because I like to think there's other people like me that really like the traditional practices. But I'm thinking that maybe the problem today is that people are kind of a mix of all different denominations, and they don't identify with one because that's, like if I lived in a small town with Reformed and Orthodox, I am not Orthodox in my practices, but I would much prefer being a member of an Orthodox shul where the service was traditional and the holidays were traditionally observed than the Reformed, even though I don't know Hebrew fluently, and I don't keep strictly. People might think I'd fit in better in Reform, but that's not where I'd want to be. So I think there's a lot of people. I mean, I have some friends of mine that keep kosher, but never light Shabbos candles, and other people that light Shabbos candles, but want a Reform service. And so there's like, I don't know that years ago there was such a mishmash.
Right, Alan.
When we heard Rabbi Danny Schiff talk, I was very impressed. And I recently went back because I knew you were going to give this class today. And I read over some of my notes and some of the things that he said in other places. And I think that his idea that modernity ended in 1990, I would have said before that, but assuming he's right, and now we're in this digital age, I think that the talk that we've been having, is this kosher? Is this halakha? Is this, what about intermarriage? I think really, given the ages of the folks here, which is representative of the synagogue, I think the answer is, I think we've moved way past it. I agree. I understand what Sue says. This is how we were raised. This is a comfort zone. I get a wonderful feeling when I'm in the sanctuary. I love hearing the Hazan sing, but I really do wonder what these buds are of the new Judaism, of the new way that this is going to evolve. And I agree with what Rabbi Schiff says. We won't know for decades just where it started and where we are. I suspect that the intermarriage question, that the pater, the familias question will be long gone by then. I think the issues are going to be more involved, more of a where how do you obtain an ethical ethos, an ethical approach that would be acceptable
Mhm.
to Jews now and should be in the future.
Right. I think, there's a certain dilemma. I think that, you know, everything has a cost and a benefit, right? And if we move in a more liberal, progressive direction, we may pick up people, but we'll also lose people, right? And there is this inconsistency, right? I sent out last week a link to an article by Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, right? Who he's the rabbi of Park Avenue Synagogue in Manhattan, with a earned PhD from the University of Chicago. A bright guy. And he points out, for example, in that article, that he had a congregant who ripped into the Hazan of their shul for skipping some verses of the Geshem prayer, which is the prayer that you say during Sukkot for rain. Okay? And why was it funny to Rabbi Cosgrove? Because this guy ripped into the cantor for skipping that part of the liturgy and then headed off to the golf course, right? So, and I remember a few years ago, when we started renting space to churches, right? And one of the questions was, would we allow them to bring food into the synagogue? Okay, and let me tell you what the halachic answer is. The halachic answer is there is no problem, right? There is no problem whatsoever. There is a problem with them bringing non-kosher food into the kitchen, because you can't, unless you're monitoring the kitchen, right? There's no reason, they can't use anything in the kitchen, so they shouldn't be bringing it in, right? But, if you're a Jewish landlord, do you have to make sure that your tenants keep kosher, right? You don't have to, right? But when we discuss this, without getting into personalities or issues, right? The two people who were most vehement that under no circumstances could we allow this, and if we did allow this, they would quit the shul, are both people who don't keep kosher, right? So that, you gotta love your Jews, right? But there's a love for tradition that doesn't necessarily translate into a fully observant lifestyle, right? And this is the issue. And so, so Rabbi Cosgrove's article, which is also worth reading, precisely because he is a conservative pulpit rabbi. It's a very different shul than our shul, but sociologically, I don't think it's all that different, right? And it is very, very rare that a conservative rabbi gets an actual halachic question. All right. And when we do, it tends to be around Pesach, right? Around keeping kosher for Pesach. And it tends to be around end of life issues. All right, by which I mean, mourning and burial, but also, you know, other types of bioethics end of life issues like, removing feeding tubes, removing respirators, hospice care, that kind of stuff,
Yeah,
right? Yeah, Alan.
yeah, this is the other Alan, Alan.
Yeah.
So first of all, I know Rabbi Cosgrove. My son and his family are members of the Park Avenue Synagogue. I've been
Right.
there many times, but to me, I see a difference, and I look at it through my son Max, who Alan Katz knows. He was raised conservative, went to the Jewish day school, and then he became very Orthodox at Brown. Subsequently, in New York, he also joined KJ, Kehilat Shalom, which is modern Orthodox. He's now having to face issues, and I don't confront him with this, of having to drive on Shabbos because he's got to take the little kid somewhere. But my point is, when I go to New York, I see, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know, a corpus of Judaism. You walk on a Saturday morning, and everybody is dressed to the nines, walking to their probably Orthodox shuls, or maybe to Park Avenue, which is conservative.
Right.
And I think it tends to um, augment the feeling of Judaism. So what do you do? I look at it as what is the corpus of Judaism, and does that have an effect in terms of if you're in a small town, if you're in Podunk, Missouri, where there may be no Jews or two Jews, what do you do? How do you assimilate? Isn't it a matter of your comfort? Like Alan said before, he mentioned the word comfort. How can you best fit in, and what does the synagogue have to offer you in terms of your religiosity versus the secular? So
Right.
so I don't think that it's waning. I see a lot of Jews, young Jews in New York, who are Orthodox, who are conservative, and they love it. So, we don't have a lot of very young people in this synagogue. We have people who are more mature. That's
Right.
that's the polite word. And so we tend to look at our roots. And I think sometimes as you age, you come back to Judaism. That's not new either, but that's just my feeling. So that's just making a couple of points here.
Right. No, I mean, look, all right, that's actually because, that's actually a good segue, actually. I mean, even if you didn't really intend it. So, if you have, in Manhattan, right, you have a group of organizations that all go by the name Hadar. There's Kehilat Hadar, there's Machon Hadar, there's Yeshiva Hadar. Okay, and they're actually on the Upper West Side, not on the Upper East
Right.
Side.
Right.
But Hadar started as an independent minyan, and they now have a yeshiva where they're actually, I think, ordaining their first group of rabbis this year. I mean, I know they're ordaining rabbis this year. I think it's their first group. They run all kinds of programs, and they fall under the rubric that they use is halachic egalitarian. Okay, meaning that they're fully halachic, fully observant, but they're egalitarian. Okay, now, somebody please tell me what is the difference between halachic egalitarian and conservative, right? And the Hadar was started by 3 rabbis, okay? 2 of those rabbis were ordained at JTS. The 3rd rabbi was actually ordained in Israel, but his father was the dean of the JTS Rabbinical School for a long time and is now the vice chancellor for religious and spiritual affairs at JTS. Okay. And, you know, I just got an announcement from the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem that um, two of their faculty members are about to receive rabbinic ordination from Hadar. Okay, now, why is Hadar not conservative? Okay, because Hadar is up and coming and sexy and vibrant and attractive, and conservative Judaism is boring and staid and old, right? So if they were to call themselves conservative, right, they wouldn't be as attractive. I mean, I think that's their perception, right? But the idea of being halakhically observant but egalitarian, or halakhically observant and, I shouldn't say but, and egalitarian, that's the core of conservative Judaism, right? So, no, in no sense, I mean, in that sense, look, to me, I am obviously, for personal reasons, deeply invested in the well-being of Kehilat Shalom. Okay, because I'm not independently rich and I'm too young to retire, right? So I have no particular interest in the well-being of any other particular institution of the conservative movement, whether it's the United Synagogue or JTS or any of the other 10 conservative synagogues in Montgomery County. I am deeply invested in the well-being of the body of ideas that conservative Judaism represents, right? That is to say that halakha is still important and vital and has room for full equality for women, full equality for gay people, full equality for trans people, that our moral concern extends to non-Jews equally as Jews, et cetera, et cetera. I don't care whether you call that conservative or Irving, right? I mean, but the ideas are really important. Having said that, I mean, Cosgrove is also correct that most conservative Jews care little to nothing about halakha, right? What they care about are mitzvot, right? And what's the difference between like halakha and mitzvot is that mitzvot are like specific Jewish things that they can do, right? And for all kinds of reasons. I mean, some of them may literally do them because they think that that's what God demands of them. But they have the right to determine what God demands of them. It's not up to the rabbi or a committee of rabbis to tell them what God demands, right? For others, not necessarily God's command, but I find it meaningful. It adds beauty to my life. It adds joy to my life. I light Shabbos candles and it reminds me of my Bubby, who was the person I loved more than anybody else in the world. Whatever it is, right? And, you know, Cosgrove, I don't think Cosgrove said this in his article, but you know, both Mordechai Kaplan almost 100 years ago and Neil Gilman much more recently said, you know, if you throw out the word halakha and you ask like knowledgeable Jews, what does the word halakha mean? They'll say it means Jewish law, right? Kaplan and Gilman said it doesn't mean Jewish law, right? Why doesn't it mean Jewish law? I know I'm looking at two lawyers here, right? If you break a law, what happens to you?
You pay the penalty.
You pay the penalty, right? A law is enforceable. If it's not enforceable, it's not a law, right? And I think there is even a concept, right? I mean, that if a law is never enforced and you get arrested for breaking it and nobody's been arrested for 20 years, right? You have a pretty good chance of getting that dismissed, right? Because it's a law that nobody follows anymore, right? And halacha is not enforceable, right? I mean, it's just not. I mean, it is in orthodoxy, not that the rabbi can throw you in jail, right? But there's a social cost for not following halacha. I mean, you mentioned your son, Max. I mean, so he may feel for whatever reason he needs to drive his kids to places on Shabbos, right? I'm sure he doesn't advertise that fact.
And he doesn't enjoy it either. I know. I mean, he enjoys being with the kids and helping them,
Right.
but it's bothering him. I know.
Right. But
Yeah.
the point that I'm making is that if it was known in his community that he did this, there would be a social price to pay.
Might be. Yeah.
Right? I mean, I don't know, maybe in KJ, not as much as in some other places, right? But the point is that there is a self-enforcing mechanism within Orthodoxy that doesn't exist elsewhere, right? And, so Cosgrove says, let's forget talking about halacha and start talking about mitzvot instead, right? And he makes the point that that's exactly what Chabad does, right? Chabad does not try to convince you to live an observant life. They try to convince you to do mitzvahs, right? And if you are an intermarried Jew and you show up at Chabad, not an issue.
Oh.
Not an issue at all. Do mitzvahs, put on tefillin, come to shul, light Shabbos candles, whatever, doesn't matter. Now that has to do, and Cosgrove doesn't discuss this, but that is because Chabad has a specific theology, which is essentially theurgist. Okay, theurgy means my actions can force God's hand. Okay, I can make God do certain things. Okay, and this goes into Lurianic Kabbalah, and I don't want to get too bogged down, but essentially within Lurianic Kabbalah, there is a belief that once the total number of mitzvahs performed by Jews tips the scale, God has to send the Messiah. So therefore, if you're an intermarried Jew, you're still a Jew, right? You put on tefillin, it's a mitzvah, right? You put on tefillin one time, it's one mitzvah. You put on tefillin twice, it's two mitzvahs. You put them on 6 days a week, it's six mitzvahs. Who knows whether that sixth time that you, intermarried Jew, put on tefillin will not be the mitzvah that tips the scale and forces God to send the Messiah, right? I mean, I have to say, from my perspective, it is an absolutely absurd theology, but it allows them to do what they do. And when they say, oh, the Chabad, they're so non-judgmental, they really are non-judgmental because they're not trying to get you to live a certain lifestyle. They're trying to get you to do mitzvahs, because if you do mitzvahs, you might tip the scale, right? And, we really look at things from a much more systemic and holistic perspective. And maybe we shouldn't. I don't know. I really don't know. Right. But, I think, and I have, I think that the biggest so, you have places where you have particular conservative congregations that are thriving. Okay. And either they're thriving because you have observant people or they have great education programs. And look, the fact of the matter is, I don't like saying this, okay, but I will. All right. White Jewish families with kids will not move into our neighborhood. They won't. White Jewish families with kids will not move into our neighborhood because of the perceived qualities of the schools, right? And that's why our congregation has the demographics it has, right? Because when we bet on Montgomery Village 50 years ago, if present trends continue, right? 50 years ago, it would have seemed like a smart bet. It turned out not to be a smart bet. That's it. We didn't do anything wrong except bet on the wrong neighborhood. I really believe that. But that's real. But the problem of conservative Judaism as a whole is that it has a very high cost of entry. Okay. And I don't mean financially. What I mean is, take a person who is Jewish, knows they're Jewish, identifies as a Jew, has no Jewish background, no Jewish upbringing whatsoever. They decide, hey, I'd like to check this Judaism out. They walk into a conservative shul. What are they going to find? Right? It's totally inaccessible to them. Totally inaccessible to them. You cannot participate. You cannot really participate in the conservative movement if you can't read Hebrew. Right? And most American Jews today can't read Hebrew. Right? So we've automatically knocked out half of our target audience. Okay? If you talk to Hillel professionals, the overwhelming majority of kids on college campuses who identify as Jewish have one Jewish parent. Right? Now, if that one Jewish parent is a mom, then halakhically they're Jewish. If it's a dad, they're not. But even if it's the mom, the rhetoric around intermarriage is not very welcoming to kids who have one Jewish parent, right? We can try to be warm and welcoming. The reality is that there's a very high barrier to entry. And that's just what we are. And I think that the two alternatives are, be other than what we are, and maybe that will work, or continue to be what we are and figure out a way to survive with smaller numbers. I really don't see a massive revival of the conservative movement as it exists today. I just don't, and I would love to be wrong. But that's kind of my thoughts. So it is a little late, but if anybody has, concluding thoughts, have at it for a couple minutes.
Do you think halakhic egalitarianism is a branding issue? In other words, they're trying to update themselves to make them, as you said, they're conservative, but is
Right.
it more of a branding issue to sell it?
I think personally, I think it is. Right. I mean, I'm sure that rabbis Tucker, Held, and Comfort would disagree.
Ah,
I think that they would disagree, but I mean, it's not like they're against the conservative movement. I mean, Rabbi Held is also an adjunct faculty member at JTS. He has nothing against the conservative movement. They just don't want that label. And I think it's a branding issue.
mhm.
And they may be right. I mean, you know,
It sounds nice.
right.
Sounds fancy.
Yeah. All right. Anybody else? Yeah, Sue.
Well, I'm thinking, I agree with Alan. I mean, maybe that's the way to go. Maybe we need to be rebranded or get a facelift or, I mean, maybe we should join forces with this other movement. More power in numbers, and maybe it would make a difference. But I do think that if we're going to start shortening the service and having it half in English, and doing this and doing that, then we might as well change the shingle to Reformed.
Right. The difference is that if you look at a place like Hadar, I mean, they have the same sort of social pressure of behavioral expectations as Orthodoxy does, right? I mean, and so, I mean, if we started calling ourselves halachic egalitarian instead of conservative, what would that mean? I mean, because we're not halachic egalitarian. I mean, what percentage of our members keep kosher, right? What percentage of our members put on tefillin, right? What percentage of our members even own tefillin? That they don't, I mean, it's just, that's not who we are. We are a community of untraditional Jews who like traditional worship. And selectively observe mitzvot that we decide are important to us individually. We're, in that way, Hadar really is different than we are. Okay, but I don't, and in that way, I mean, Hadar is different even than Park Avenue Synagogue. The difference is that Park Avenue Synagogue might have 20% of its congregation who are really seriously observant. And when you have a congregation the size of Park Avenue, the 20% who are seriously observant is a fairly large body of people. But it's 20% as opposed to 3%. It's not 100% as opposed to 3%. It's still a different type of community. All right. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Yeah, Marilyn.
Right. Going back to the intermarriage, if is the issue, well, I mean, if somebody who's 20 generations Methodist, it's an intermarriage, but if a patrilineal descending, I'm not sure what the verb is, but if you recognize patrilineal Judaism, would that change the acceptance of intermarriage?
Well, I mean, they're connected, obviously, right? Because, if you're doing the wedding in your shul, you want to be able to consider the kids of that marriage as Jews, right? I mean, the issue is, so I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. I mean, they're not necessarily, I mean, the thing is that if somebody comes to me, like, all right, so my brother has two daughters, okay? My brother is Jewish, his ex-wife is Catholic, all right? Their two daughters were raised as Unitarians and they both really identify as Unitarians, right? But if they came to me and they were engaged to a Jew, either one of them is engaged to a Jewish guy, and they came to me and they said, Uncle Chuck, will you do our wedding? The answer would have to be right now, no, because you are not recognized as Jewish, right? If you were willing to go through a conversion, then I could, right? You know, although technically the Reform movement wouldn't recognize them as Jewish either because they weren't raised as Jews, right? And so you have this paradoxical situation where you actually have people who, let's say you have a Jewish mother and a non-Jewish father, but you weren't raised as a Jew. Halachically, you're a Jew, right? So I could perform that person's marriage, and in theory, a Reform rabbi could, because they're not Jewish because they weren't raised as a Jew,
Okay.
right? I mean, in practice, I can't see that happening, right? But I mean, let me just, I mean, because I think this is an interesting story. Okay, so back in the early 90s, I was the Hillel director at American University. Okay, and there's an organization in DC called the Jewish Study Center, which runs adult education classes. They still exist, although I don't think they're as big as they used to be. But they run an introduction to Judaism class, okay, which is not, it's not a conversion class, but it could be a first step towards a conversion class. But at least in the 90s, a lot of the people in that class, it was a Jew and a non-Jew who were getting married. The non-Jew was not planning to convert, but they wanted to know more about Judaism for their, you know, extended family and whatnot. Okay. I taught that class once, and I got a call or an email from one of the couples in the class, and they came to talk to me and they said, we love this class and we really like you. And we know that you're a conservative rabbi and you can't do our wedding. We're trying to find a rabbi to do our wedding. And all of the rabbis that we've spoken to, there's just no there. I mean, that's not what they said, but you know, is there a rabbi who would marry us who is more like you? And I said, you mean you want to be married by the type of rabbi who doesn't do intermarriages? And they said, yeah, basically. And I said, well, I mean, you know what the answer is, right? But I found that discussion really instructive, right? Because I mean, you know, and I find it interesting is that most ordained Reform rabbis who don't work for the Reform movement, who are either retired or have other types of job, belong to conservative shuls. They don't belong to Reform shuls because I mean, I hope nobody watches this who's Reform, but I think there's really not a lot of substance to it, right? And therefore, I mean, to become, I think, Sue, you're right, to become a sort of imitation Reform movement, I don't know that anybody's really served by it. I really don't. I mean, I do think that there are branding issues. I do think that if we could find a way to be more accessible without sort of changing the substance of what we offer. But I mean, I think Cosgrove's article, I mean, I don't 100% agree with it, but it's worth reading. It is worth reading in terms of the language that we use, really, of doing mitzvahs instead of following halakha. I mean, I think there is something to that, but it's a very complicated issue. I mean, this is really complicated because, you know, as Alan, you said almost at the beginning of this class, right? We're on the cusp of a massive societal change, you know, and it's like, I mean, it's like COVID, right? You're trying to build the plane while you're flying, right? Which is why so many of the things that we knew at the beginning of the pandemic, we now know are not true. And it's not because people were lying, and it's not because of Bill Gates putting microchips in everybody. It's because they're trying to fly the plane while they're building. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to, you know, I mean, we don't have the luxury of saying, we're just gonna stop everything for a year or 2 years and figure this stuff out, right? We got to keep doing it while we're trying to figure it out. And it's really complicated. And, you know, I'll end with a quote from Yogi Berra, you know, making predictions is really difficult, especially about the future. All right.
Rabbi, thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you. Good night.
pleasure.
Thank
Shabbat
you,
shalom,
everybody. Good night. Good
Thanks.
night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.